today, book nerds. Today we're going to be talking to an award-winning, critically acclaimed author, Taylor Brown, who's quickly established himself in the top echelon of Southern writers. And today he's going to be talking to us about his upcoming novel, Wingwalkers, an epic historical novel about a female wingwalker and her husband, a former World War I ace pilot, and their journey across Depression-era America performing acts of aerial daring, while a young William Faulkner attempts to take creative flight. In 1934, during Mardi Gras in New Orleans, William Faulkner had a brief but memorable encounter with two aviator motorcyclists, a man and a woman, whom he joined in drinking, cruising, and flying. Upon learning this little-known fact, Taylor Brown wondered about this mysterious duo. Who were they, and how did their lives intersect with Faulkner's? In Wingwalkers, Taylor Brown takes this tantalizing tidbit from Faulkner's real life and sets it aloft by imagining the lives of this adventurous couple and how their paths came to cross with his. And without further ado, book nerds, let's get into the interview. All right, book nerds, welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today I have with me Taylor Brown, and I'm so excited. We're going to be talking to him, getting to know more about the upcoming release for the books and things like that. So without further ado, Taylor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me so much, Jean.
All right. So I'm going to be doing the interview with you today. My name is Narry, and this is going to be for the Jean podcast interview. And then for everything going on, for anybody that maybe isn't too familiar with your books or your writing, can you give a little intro?
Absolutely. So I'm Taylor Brown. I'm based out of Savannah, Georgia. Was born in this area. My first book, Fallen Land, came out in 2016 from St. Martin's Press, and then followed The River of Kings, Gods of Howell Mountain, Pride of Eden, and on April 19th, Wingwalkers comes out.
Awesome. Super excited about that. So Wingwalkers, tell us a little bit about the background of that story. Give us like a little look into the story itself.
Yeah, so it's set during the Great Depression mainly, and the main characters are a husband and wife duo. They're barnstormers. The husband, Zeno, he was a World War I ace, and then became a pilot and barnstormer after the war. And his wife, Della, who's really the protagonist and the star of the story, she's a wingwalker. And interestingly enough, the story actually braids together with the life of William Faulkner, about the first 40 years of William Faulkner's life, told from an aviation angle, actually. And the story for me really started with a photograph that I happened across on the wall of Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi. I was there in 2016 for the Oxford Conference for the book for my first novel, Fallen Land. And the day after my event, I was just kind of exploring Oxford, and I went into Square Books, which, if some of the listeners don't know, is kind of one of the most storied bookstores, I think, in the South. A lot of authors have lived in Oxford and, been associated with that place. And the walls are just covered in all this literary memorabilia from authors who lived there or visited. And I was on the staircase landing, and I saw this old photograph. It was actually a shadow box or a presentation box on the wall. And it had this old photograph of William Faulkner in it. And it wasn't the Faulkner that you're used to seeing with, gray hair and a meerschaum pipe and, who's won the Nobel Prize. He was really young, you could tell it was him, but barely. He's right out of his teens, maybe. He looked on the edge of his teens. He was dressed in a flying uniform, a Royal Air Force uniform. And in the shadow box was also a pair of RAF wings and a regimental tie. And this sketch that I later found out was done in his own hand of a World War I biplane. So I came to find out this whole history of Faulkner from an aviation angle that I didn't know about, how he'd gone off to be a pilot or tried to be a pilot in World War I, and came back home telling a lot of stories that weren't necessarily true about his exploits flying, a lot of tall tales, but all of this made its way into his work. And years later, he went to the opening of the what's now the Lakefront Airport in New Orleans. It was then called the Shushan Airport. It was opened during Mardi Gras in 1934, and it was a really big to-do. Everyone thought it was going to be the new air hub of the Americas, and they had an air show, and it was all integrated with Mardi Gras, and they had air races. And in the big Faulkner biography done by Joseph Blotner, talks about how Faulkner spent a night. He didn't come home one night with the friends he was staying with. And when he came home the next morning, he was hungover. And he told this wild story of this night he'd spent with his husband and wife who were aviators in the meat. And we don't know anything else about the content of that story of what really happened. So I decided to reimagine who they were and how their lives intersected with Faulkner's. And that's really the core of the book.
Very nice. I love that, tying history together with like your own version of the story and everything. And I have to admit, I love a lot of William Faulkner's writing, so I'm a huge fan. I'm super looking forward to it.
Same here, same here. So it was really neat to be able to, dig a little bit more into his life and to write from his point of view.
That's amazing. And so I imagine growing up, you were probably into a lot of like history and maybe a little bit more of like stories that tell about the Americas and just the things around us.
I guess I was always interested in history. I didn't necessarily think of it that way, but I guess I was interested in story so much, right? And friends of mine who are, historians, we always talk a lot about how story and history are so intertwined. I mean, the words themselves are, history is built from the word story, right? And how, history is really a compilation of stories and is told from, it is not as objective as anyone likes to think it is, even from, in academic circles. And so I think that it really started from there. And something always stuck with me, which is what Faulkner had said actually himself, which was write what you know. And he really became more successful and found his grounding when he quit writing about all this kind of different things and focused on the ground beneath his feet, what he called the little postage stamp of, Oxford, Mississippi. And, obviously created this whole universe, Yoknapatawpha County, out of his homeland. And that idea kind of stuck with me. And so I, find myself digging into the history of the places where I have lived or do live and just kind of uncovering stories. And that to me is a lot of fun. And also that's how I tend to, find my stories, I think.
I love that, especially drawing inspiration from everything around you, because so many people like to look far out into like different parts of the world when right in your backyard you have so much inspiration, and that's pretty awesome.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
I think of it a lot. People ask, where the stories come from and that kind of thing. And I always say one of the unexpected for me, I never really considered it until later, but one of the unexpected kind of boons or advantages or awesome things about being a writer is that it gives you reason to be really hyper attuned to the world around you, to be, all the gurus tell us to be mindful, to be present, to not get lost in the future or the past or in our anxieties and all these kinds of things. And as a writer, we tend to, get lost in our imaginations, and that can be a very beautiful thing. But this idea that you always kind of have a reason to have your antenna up, to be looking for stories and looking at the world around you in a more attuned way. I don't know. I find that a beautiful way to live, and one of something that people don't talk about that often, but to me is important to being a writer and is also just good for your life in general, probably.
No, absolutely. I definitely agree. I'd imagine that, especially with you being an author and kind of being maybe like more hyper aware of things going on around you, it makes for some really cool details and things that maybe normal people in their day-to-day don't necessarily pick up because they don't look at the world the same way, which is pretty
Right.
awesome. Which kind of leads me into our next question. your writing process. When you come up with the stories and you start writing, you pick up, your pencil, pen, or you pick up your laptop to start typing up a new story. How's the process go? Do you usually start with the plot, the storyline, or do you usually think of characters first off?
That's a good question. For me, it usually starts with one thing, and it could be a character, it could be an image, it could be an idea of the way something starts or ends. It's just one little seed or nugget, but it's not always necessarily from the same angle, but it's something like that. And then for me, interestingly enough, I usually start with a short story. Um, that was not the case with Wing Walkers, but that has been the case with most of my books. In that I well, one, I love short stories. That's kind of was my, I think of as a apprenticeship, was writing short stories and trying to get those published. And my first book was a collection of short stories, and I still love that form. And I also think that for finding what's a story that's has enough depth and is big enough for a novel, a short story can be really good for that. Because a lot of the time I start with a short story, and then I just realize that there's so much more here than you can get through in 15 or 20 pages. And although I think the form is a lot different and it isn't so easy to just jump from a short story into a novel, it has been a starting point for me more often than not. That really has been the case. And so I'll maybe start with some idea. In this case, if I had written a short story about wingwalkers, it probably would have centered around that picture. And it probably would have just been either been about Faulkner or about Della's story or something like that. And I would have realized, because this is what's happened in the past, that there's just so much more here, these characters. But then you've already fleshed out the characters, or you've fleshed out maybe, climactic or important act in the book in that story, and then you can kind of let it grow from there. I don't typically outline. I have tried to do that. I think it would in some ways make my writing life a little less anxiety ridden in some ways if I knew where everything was going. But every time that I have come up with an outline, I broke it, first of all, again and again. I didn't stick with it, but also when I did stay with it, it just made things feel a little more wooden and less alive to me. So I typically don't outline, but I have plenty of writer friends who do, and that's what works for them, so it's just finding what works for you. But for me, I usually only know a few macro level things, maybe how it'll end or how it starts, or a moment in the book that is really clear to me, or I just know who the characters are really clearly, and I just let it fly from there.
Absolutely. That's pretty cool. Thanks for giving us that glimpse into your writing process. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And so I am curious, because you mentioned a few of your writer friends and things like that. Do you have anybody that you work with personally that kind of inspires you, that's kind of you've worked with, or maybe like a mentor or anything like that?
I do. I have there are a few people that are kind of like that. I would say the most important one for me, the closest one for me, is a friend of mine named Jason Fry, who I met in Wilmington, North Carolina, when I used to live there. And the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, although I didn't go there for an MFA, I don't have an MFA in creative writing. They have a great program that has drawn all these awesome writers to that area. A lot of people that are either still teach as part of the program or, went to the program but stayed in Wilmington. And so when I was researching whether I should do an MFA, and I was looking at schools, I found Wilmington. I was living in California, in San Francisco at the time, but I just happened to visit. I really liked it, and I moved there. And Jason, I met him in a co-working space that I was in, and is a graduate of UNC Wilmington, and he's mainly a travel and food writer. He writes for Our State and a bunch of magazines, and he writes travel books for Moon. A lot of the North Carolina mountain books he writes. But he's a poet with a beautiful, he's got a really good ear, and he's an amazing editor. And so he is my kind of main reader that I send my work to and gives me feedback on it and stuff like that in a more professional way. And then I have, kind of other writer friends slash peers, Katie Simpson Smith, Kent Wascombe, David Joy, Michael Ferris Smith, Wiley Cash. Those are a few of the ones that I'm more close to. We don't typically read each other's work as much and give feedback, but those kind of friendships and connections are just invaluable because, it can be tough emotionally, the industry and just, doing what we do isn't the easiest thing. So having someone else that does the same thing that you can talk to about it and both commiserate, ask for advice, give advice, all of those things is huge. We just had the Savannah Book Festival here it was in February, and it was really the first time in 2 years because all the conferences, all the festivals have been canceled. It's the first time I got to kind of interact with other writers I know or just met in person really in a couple of years in any kind of big way. And it was so fulfilling. And, I was like, God, I needed this, because it can be isolating, especially in the last couple of years, the era that we've been, living in. So.
Oh, absolutely. No, I love that being surrounded by people that you can just talk to and share everything with, especially as a creative, I think is so important.
I really agree.
Absolutely. And I know it's been absolutely crazy during the whole pandemic. Was there anything, I'm not sure how it was down where you were living at the time, but how was it kind of getting through that as a writer? Are you more finding yourself to be considered more of like an introvert or an extrovert? And how did you kind of handle everything during the pandemic?
So I am pretty introverted, so it probably didn't have quite the same, impact in that way and, an emotional way, as some other people and maybe a lot of other writers are like that. And I was fortunate because, well, stuff, it just sometimes things were open and sometimes they weren't. And, we went through different cycles of that and everything. But about 2 or 3 years ago, I kind of trained myself to be able to write outside, strangely enough, because I was spending so much time inside writing and I was living in this beautiful place. And, I would get off work and it would be 4 or 5 o'clock and I would go into a dark cafe and stay there. When I would come out after writing, it would be almost dark. And I kind of thought, I would like that, I remember there were tables outside at this cafe where I was working at the time, doing most of my writing. And it was actually the Barnes and Noble in Wilmington, North Carolina, but they had these tables outside. And I thought, how nice would it be to be outside? And so the first few times that I went out there to write, it was very distracting. There's people walking by, there's cars parking. It's just not, sometimes it's hot, sometimes it's cold, sometimes there's bugs, sometimes the wind's blowing. And I found it hard, but I knew if I stuck with it, I would get used to it. And I did. And so I kind of had already been used to it. So here, when everything was closed down, I just went to Savannah has all these beautiful squares and a bunch of public parks and lots of, benches where you can sit outside. So I just started going to the different squares or parks and just writing there outside. And I can't say it was necessarily easy, but I was better prepared probably than some other people because I had done it in the past, but like June 2020, when it was like, I'm in Savannah, Georgia, it's like 96 degrees, 100% humidity. There's bugs and mosquitoes, and but in some ways it's like you have to concentrate, it's almost forces you to concentrate or you'll be miserable. Because if you can get into the story, you don't even think about how hot you are or the, mosquitoes flying around everywhere. But it was one of those things where I think that I didn't realize how much it was impacting me until later. For instance, even like I said, last month with the Savannah Book Festival, seeing other authors and talking to them, I didn't realize how much I missed that until I was able to have it again and have that community. Because, you can communicate with people online or via Zoom or via email, but in the end, you don't have quite the same connection as you have if you're just, sitting at a bar or just in person, And so that was really nice, and I didn't realize how much I had missed that. And
Oh,
funny enough, I've
definitely.
stuck with the outside writing thing. I almost never write inside. I do at home, and I do work at home a good bit, but when I'm outside of home, um, at a cafe or a coffee shop or something like that, I sit outside a whole lot now, even though I don't have to because most of the places have, opened back up.
Gotcha. Nice. I like that a lot because, it kind of ties into how you mentioned earlier about how you're always taking in the world around you and you're just kind
Mhm,
of sitting there writing away and coming up with the next story. So that's pretty cool.
mhm.
Absolutely. And do you have any books that you're kind of engrossed in right now or anything that you're reading that you'd want to share with any of our readers?
It's interesting, I've been on this nonfiction kick, and I have come across a couple of, books on this nonfiction kick that I found fascinating. Uh, the first of which is a book I just read called Breath by, I don't remember the author's name right now. I think it's James Nestor, but it's about the science of breath, and it's linking together um, the science behind a lot of really interesting things, like the practice of breathing in Buddhism and Zen, the practice of breathing as you learn in yoga, and the benefits of breathing in, being more mindful of your breath, breathing through your nose, breathing more slowly, all of this really interesting science. I just found it fascinating. It obviously isn't, very well connected to, any of my work that I'm working on right now necessarily, although little details find their way into things. I was absolutely engrossed with that book. And right now, I'm really excited to get into. My partner, Addie Joe, has been reading all of these Craig Childs books, who is a nonfiction writer who writes out of the West. And she's really excited about his books. We did a big trip out west with our van last summer, and so I'm just really, really excited because she's been basically almost telling me all about the books as she reads them. So I'm really interested to dive into his work right now.
Awesome. That's pretty cool. That's good to know. And, I always appreciate because, everybody that kind of watches or listens or supports the podcast, we're all readers. So we always got like a stack of books somewhere in a corner. And I'm sure
Right.
everybody
Yep.
always appreciates having something added to that list.
Yep.
And I am curious because I know that you spend a lot of your time writing and probably just taking in a lot of your environment. Do you have any hobbies outside of writing that you kind of like to do?
I do. I do. I'm pretty if anybody ends up following me on social media, they'll probably see that I'm big when it comes to two wheel. So whether it's bicycles or motorcycles, that's kind of my big hobby outside of riding. And actually, my what I think of as what I call work. My day job is actually as editor in chief of a motorcycle site called Bikebound. We feature custom motorcycles, cafe racers, scramblers, street trackers from all over the world. And so that is kind of my job during the day, is talking to motorcycle builders at these workshops all over the world. And we kind of tell the story behind the bikes that they feature and have just, come out with, bikes that are usually heavily modified. And so I have a garage full of old motorcycles, of course, only half of which run at any given time, and half of which are in some state of disassembly. But um I just love it. And uh, I usually I kind of have a fairly strict writing regimen in terms of when I go, the time of day and where I go. I generally go at the same time of day and to the same place. And I always like to either ride my bike or my motorcycle there and back, although it's not the safest mode of transportation. And I'm hyper aware of that. But on the other hand, for me, it's just such a great way that, we get so disconnected these days. We get so tied into our phones and to the virtual world. When, for me, what I found is either if I'm on my bicycle or my motorcycle, you can't be like that. You cannot be distracted. You have to be aware of the world around you because it is dangerous. And, the drivers are distracted, and you are not, even a simple fender bender could be, a big issue on a motorcycle or on a bicycle. And so I feel like I'm able to kind of, when I go to the cafe in the afternoon, I'm able to write. I can leave behind the stress of the day. I can forget about it a little bit because I have to, for that 5 to 15 minutes that it takes me to get there. And then when I come home, it's a really good break. Lots of times when I come home, I continue working, but still it's that period of time that you're kind of forced to be back, hyper present, hyper aware of the world around you, vigilant. And that for me has become a really important practice, I guess. And so that's a really, pretty significant part of my life outside of the writing.
Absolutely. That is really cool. That's definitely not something you hear about every day from some of our other authors. So that's a really cool snippet of your life that
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing that with us. That's cool.
Thank you.
All right. And I mean, I'm trying to think of some other things that I can ask you. Is there anything that you are thinking about that you want to share with any of our readers personally?
Nothing, comes to mind, jumps to mind immediately. I just, I'm excited about the new book. I hope that, other folks are, and, get out there. And I'm excited because we're going to do a book tour this time. For 2020, my book Pride of Eden came out in March 2020. And literally we had the whole book tour scheduled, and it was the book came out on Tuesday, as they do. And it was the Monday morning. I had my bags packed, literally about to get into the car to hit the road. And the CDC, we were watching everything really closely, what was happening, developments with COVID. And the CDC came out and said, no groups over X amount. I can't remember what it was at the time. And so we had to axe it right there, whole book tour.
Oh, man.
And then no one knew how to use Zoom yet, right? Everything was really buggy. It was just it was a crazy time. And it was so interesting because the last book, Pride of Eden, is set on an exotic animal sanctuary. Basically, it's a big cat sanctuary. It came out the same week as Tiger King at the same time, which was just this weird, thing, because all of a sudden that was like the meme, the, pop culture thing that everyone knew about and was talking about. And, but it was kind of hard because Pride of Eden took a lot of those things really seriously in terms of animal welfare and how some of the culturally how some of this stuff works, but was it was tough because we weren't able to get it out there quite the same way because everything was kind of buried underneath the craziness of COVID. So I'm really excited to get back out there on the road and see folks in person a little bit and do some events and all that kind of thing.
Absolutely. I think everybody's super happy to be kind of out of the pandemic. And
Mm-hmm.
I know you mentioned earlier coming out of the coastal areas of Georgia and then moving to San Francisco. Where are you based out of now? Where do you work out of?
I'm in Savannah, Georgia now. We moved here in late 2019 and absolutely love it. I grew up about an hour south of here on the Georgia coast, so it feels a lot like coming home. My mom is still there. That was a consideration, when we moved, to be closer to her. But it's just a great town. When I was growing up, we didn't visit here very much. But I think that one thing that's done so much for it is the Savannah College of Art and Design is here. And really in the last 25 years, they bought up the campus is basically spread. There's no one centralized campus. It's spread all over town in all these old historic buildings. And they bought all these old kind of rundown buildings and restored them and then, turned it into parts of the university. And then that brought in this influx of just, creative folks that have been going to the school for the last 25 years and a lot of them are sticking around and a lot of them are in school now. And so it gives Savannah this kind of creative edge that is just kind of a beautiful thing because, it kind of blends with this kind of more all the history that's here and the oaks and the, the kind of old Savannah aesthetic that you think of, from things like Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. But there's this really kind of young, creative influence that's amazing. But yeah, I've kind of been all over. I've lived in Buenos Aires, San Francisco, mountains of Western North Carolina, and for a good long time on the North Carolina coast in Wilmington. But we are absolutely loving Savannah. It's the community is really supportive of the arts. It's really supportive of authors. The bookstores are awesome here. The indie bookstores, the Book Lady and E-Shaver. For anyone who visits, I highly recommend going to both of those. They're right downtown, the most beautiful settings that you can imagine. Flannery O'Connor's childhood home is downtown, really close to there. It's a really neat place.
That's awesome. That makes me want to go back and visit. I think I've been through Savannah about a handful of times on some random road trips, but you make it sound like a really, really great destination.
It is. And if you're like me and you're into history, you can't, there's so much, I have a thing for port towns, right? Like my favorite town, New Orleans is a favorite of mine. I lived in Wilmington, North Carolina for a long time, which is, nicknamed the Port City and has all this old like pirate history and all this stuff. And then, Savannah, another port city that, just over time, they brought in all these different cultures and all this interesting history, and it's just rich with it,
Awesome. That's really cool.
Yeah. If you ever come, let me know, and I'll give you some recommendations and all that stuff,
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. You'll hear from me next time I decide to go through Savannah, Georgia.
All right.
All right. And then my last few questions here for you. So with your book, Wing Walkers, that's going to be coming out, tell us about the release dates, and then also where can our readers look for your books?
So it comes out on April 19th, Wing Walkers does, and it should be available from anywhere books are sold. I highly recommend, if you got a local bookstore, supporting them and getting it there. Local bookstores have just been such, my whole life have been such a refuge and a sanctuary for me. They're just amazing places. So if you can get it there versus a big box store, I highly recommend it. But you should be able to get it anywhere books are sold. If you're looking for a spot, you can check out my website, TaylorBrownFiction.com, where I recommend some of my local stores where you can get signed copies. And I'm happy to inscribe them for anyone. I can inscribe it before it gets shipped out. If you just let them know, in the comment section when you check out, I can do that. And I'm also really liking this new bookshop.org. I guess it's a couple years old now, but if you go through them, it helps support any bookstores, even if you don't get it directly from an indie store. So I highly recommend that. You can check out the events page on my website, because we are doing a book tour of about, I think 12 or 15 spots so far. We might add a few more, mostly in the South. But some of my favorite stores, we're going to hit New Orleans, Atlanta, Oxford, Mississippi, a couple places in the Carolinas, obviously a few places in Georgia. So check that out. A couple places in Alabama. So check that out. Would love to see any of the listeners, if they happen to be, in those areas, at an actual in-person event. So it'll be nice to be back on the road and actually see some readers in person.
Awesome. That is super exciting, Taylor. And I'm really looking forward to the release, and I'm sure we're going to have quite a few people following, and it's super exciting. It's a great story, and I think it's going to be super successful.
Well, thank you so much. I'm excited about it.
Alright, that's all for today, book nerds. Remember that Wing Walkers is going to be on sale starting April 19th. And before we go today, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Taylor Brown for joining us and taking the time for the interview. We really appreciate it. And Taylor, before we go, is there anything that you'd like to add for our listeners today?
Thanks so much for having me. Everybody check out JeanBookNerd on YouTube. Check out their YouTube channel for the full interview, and also check out the website, JeanBookNerd.com. You can get a full transcript there, and I hope you guys really enjoy it. Thank you so much for having me. I've really, really enjoyed this.